what's up and welcome to Game Positive. Today's going to be a little bit of a different episode as there's been some pretty big news in the gaming sphere in regards to Xbox and Bethesda's delay of Starfield and Redfall, and some pretty, let's say, interesting takes that have been coming out around that subject, and I really wanted to get my opinion out onto the podcast verse, so that we can maybe put out some of the fires or at least help contain them a little bit as they are kind of burning furiously right now. So there's not going to be a feature necessarily attached to this specific episode. That will release on its own very soon. That feature that is upcoming has a collaboration aspect to it with some other creators, and we just haven't gotten to sit down and have that conversation yet. So I hope you enjoy this take on the Xbox Bethesda delay of Starfield and Redfall. And yeah, let me know what you think, and hopefully it all makes sense in the end. Thank you. So if you are living under a rock and have not heard, Xbox and Bethesda have revealed that they are delaying the release of Starfield and Redfall from the last quarter of 2022 into the first or second quarter of 2023. Now, obviously, this is a gut punch to any Xbox fan who has their eyes on these big exclusives for the fall. It's something that I was pretty excited for. This reveal was very painful for me, and I imagine the teams working on these games felt that pain as well, because they want us to be able to play their work, obviously. However, the fallout from this announcement is pretty outrageous, and the gaming community at large is kind of flying off the deep end a little bit, in my opinion. So I wanted to spend some time here dissecting what is happening with Microsoft and what the future of the Green Team really looks like. Before I jump in though, I just want to reiterate that it is completely and totally okay to be upset that these games you were excited for have been delayed. I am upset. I want to play them. I'm not an Xbox apologist. This is not damage controlling. What I am about to talk about are not apologies. They are realities. So let's jump in. So I have seen a lot of takes from different creators out there, and I see a lot of them asking the same questions. How did they not know this game was going to need a delay earlier? How was there not a backup plan? Does Microsoft have management issues? Does Microsoft have delivery issues? And it's these questions that I'm going to dig into today. So first up, how could they not tell that this game was not ready ages ago? Why would you give us a release date so early if you weren't sure? You have to have known that something was wrong. All right, so I admit that giving a release date so early was a mistake, and I suspect that in the future you probably won't see that done as often. A lot of stuff can obviously change in the amount of time between when they originally revealed the date and now, and there's this delay is proof of that. But I kind of want to dive into this a little bit and give you guys kind of an example of game development, because I think the perception of game development from some people's point of view, I should say, is a little skewed. I think that a lot of us look at game development as, like, let's say filling a glass of water, right? Over time, you pour the water into the glass fills up with water until it eventually is full, and then the game is released. It's like a linear progression of being 10% full, 20% full, 50% full, 100% full, game is released. But that's not how game development works, and that's not how software development works. What really happens is they're not filling a cup with water. They're building the cup, okay? What I'm getting at is that if at any point in time, no matter how close you are to the end of being finished constructing this cup, if there is any chink or hole in that cup, it's not going to hold water and the game is not going to work, okay? Game development is not something that happens linearly. It's something that is very sporadic. All of these pieces are built almost in isolation, and they all come together near the end of development, which can make it hard sometimes to really see what's going to happen or point out these little problems that can arise. Now, it's not super common for big games to get these high-profile delays, but there's also a lot of other factors that are coming into this. For instance, Starfield started development with one publisher being self-published by Bethesda, and now it is shifting hands over to being published by Microsoft. And also there is this thing called COVID, which I will dive into a little bit more later. And I know people don't like to talk about that anymore. They're getting tired of that being a quote excuse. Things change, scope changes, milestones change, and most importantly, like I said, the publisher changed. Now, this could bite me later, but this is what I genuinely believe, okay? Sony has risen the bar, and I know for a fact that Microsoft is looking at their success, and I'm talking about the critical success of the games that they release. I know firsthand that Microsoft has internal reviews of competitors' products. There was a leak of an internal Microsoft review for The Last of Us where they literally say something along the lines of there is no equal to this in terms of its level of polish and in its fidelity. Like, this is the blueprint. That's like a direct quote from people at Microsoft who are praising what Sony is doing with things like The Last of Us, God of War, the list goes on, right? So what was acceptable for Microsoft and potentially what was acceptable for Bethesda might not be acceptable anymore from a quality standpoint. So all of these things can come together and cause unforeseen scope changes and unforeseen milestone changes, or maybe things are not up to snuff. And whatever the case may be, the game was delayed. So I have a feeling they didn't find out that the game was going to need to be delayed at this meeting that they posted about on Twitter. It's probably something where it was, if we don't hit X milestone, which was probably some point near the beginning of the year, then the game is going to be delayed. And then we're going to have to create a PR strategy around when to announce it and stuff like that. And for the record, I think announcing it before the showcase is definitely the right move. We would rather be disappointed now and be excited by what we see in June versus the flip side of that. So hopefully that addresses the reason why it was delayed now and wasn't delayed, or why they would have announced it with the assumption that it could have been released in November, and how things could have changed along the way to where it can make sense to have to delay the game this far out. Now, in hindsight, I bet you, like I said, they're looking at this and saying, hey, we probably shouldn't announce the release date a year plus away from the actual release date. And they likely probably won't do that in the future. Next question. How was there no backup plan? There was a backup plan. There was a backup plan that we know of, and there's likely more to the backup plan that we don't know of that will be revealed at the showcase. So one thing to think about is Microsoft does not pay for exclusives anymore. They don't do the Tomb Raider deals. They don't do the Final Fantasy deals that Sony does. They develop exclusives either within their first party, or in some cases, which we'll probably see a lot of at E3, they build and fund games from third-party developers, like what's coming from Stoic or what's coming from potentially IO and stuff like that. And what they do to kind of supplement the fact that they're no longer buying Final Fantasy exclusive games or buying Tomb Raider exclusive games is they supplement that with Game Pass Day 1 releases. Now, Atomic Heart and especially Stalker 2 were very big pieces of that Game Pass Day 1 releases for 2022. And unfortunately, there was a massive conflict in Ukraine, which you've probably heard about, which is where both of those games are being made, and thus they had to be delayed. Now, last year at E3, one of the games that got the largest segment in terms of its preview was Stalker 2. Stalker, as a franchise, you might not have heard of it because it was mostly on PC, and if you're a console-only player, it might be something that you're not super familiar with, but it is a massive IP in gaming. It was a critically and commercial successful game when it originally released way back. And Stalker 2 is looked at as a big AAA release. Like, it's looked at as something like a BioShock, where it's a first-person immersive sim that is polished and supposed to be a AAA release. How it lands, who knows? But that was a big pillar of Xbox's strategy for 2022, and that was supposed to launch already, I believe. It was supposed to launch, I believe, in the spring or early summer, and that got delayed, obviously, because there's literally a war happening. How could Microsoft have predicted that was going to happen in 2022, right? So that's just super unlucky. And there also is a ton of other games that have already hit Game Pass as Day 1 Game Pass exclusives. MLB The Show, Rainbow Six Extraction, Weird West, Crusader Kings 3, Trek to Yomi. There's way more games coming to Game Pass soon. Scorn, A Plague Tale Requiem, As Dusk Falls, Replace, Somerville, and perhaps even more that are yet to be announced at the showcase. Now, I know they're not exclusives, but I've said this before. If you're a multi-console owner, right, and you have a limited budget for what games you can buy, i.e. you can't just go and buy every game, which I think is the majority of multi-console owners, or you are a single console owner and you're looking to purchase one or the other, and one of them is going to have all these games show up on a service that's affordable, then if you don't have the funds or you don't want to spend the money to buy all the games, then they are exclusive to Xbox because you can only get them by your personal means on Xbox, right? So that is their strategy, is these day one releases, and we've had a lot of them. There's going to be a lot more of them, and the big one that they had for the 2022 unfortunately got delayed due to the war in Ukraine. So that is very random in terms of being able to predict that, and it's very unfortunate because that would have not made up for the delay of Redfall and Starfield, but it definitely would have made their 2022 look a lot better. Now, I also think we'll probably get a reveal at the showcase saying that Forza Motorsport's coming in the fall. I think a lot of people are expecting that, and that would have also been part of the quote backup plan had both of these games needed to be delayed. Now, say what you want about that being enough or not enough, but that is the plan. There was plans in place, but a lot of problems have happened this year for Microsoft. Now that brings me to the next point. Does Microsoft have management issues? No, I don't believe that they do. I don't believe this for a second. And if you are an Xbox gamer who had played on Xbox from the release of the Xbox One until the release of the Xbox Series consoles, then you should feel the same way. If anything, I think that they are experiencing positive changes from a management perspective that is resulting in better games. Let's take a look at what Xbox has published over the Xbox One generation. Keep in mind, most of these games hit their release dates and they were not delayed. We got State of Decay 2, Sea of Thieves, Quantum Break, Crackdown 3, Bleeding Edge, Halo Wars 2, Rush, a Disney Pixar adventure, Scream Ride, Rise, Recore. None of these games had immense critical success. In fact, almost all of them, I would argue that all of them, released in a kind of lukewarm state, especially when you compare it to what their competitors were doing. Then you have games like Fable Legends, Scalebound, Project Spark, that were basically dead on arrival and just canceled. And you have a huge investment into Kinect early on with Fantasia, Disneyland Adventures, Kinect Sports. Like everybody knows how that went. Okay, that was the management that was in the previous regime. Now let's look at recent history. Psychonauts, delayed. Halo Infinite, delayed. Flight Simulator on console, delayed. Deathloop, delayed. Do you know what else these games have in common other than them all being delayed? They all have extreme critical praise and Game Award nominations. So yes, all these games were delayed. Is that poor management? No. That is management saying these types of releases, these State of Decay 2s, the state that Sea of Thieves launched in, Crackdown 3, Quantum Break, Rise, Recore, this type of game, this level of quality is not acceptable anymore. This is not what we're aiming for. Sure, they may happen. I'm not going to sit here and say everything that Xbox releases is going to be like a Sony God of War, Ghost of Tsushima, Last of Us 2 type release. No one is going to have a 100% hit rate. Even Sony doesn't have a 100% hit rate. But going from a 0% hit rate almost, I mean, Halo 5 has its issues, but I really liked it. Halo MCC has a ton of issues, but has evolved into a good game. A lot of these games have honestly evolved into good games. Outside of Gears and Forza, Xbox really had an extremely low hit rate. And their goal, I believe, is to increase that hit rate to be more on par with what their competitors are doing. So is it a management problem, these delays? No, I think this is management stepping in, whether it be someone like Phil or someone like Matt Booty or just the internal leads at the studios, which is more likely the case. Because if you look at a lot of these games, I think that it wasn't necessarily just the publisher, Microsoft, saying push these games out the door. A lot of these games were made under third-party contract agreements where they have a finite amount of money. And it's very hard to justify spending more money, even though the publisher is as big as Microsoft. So, I don't think that there's a management issue. I think management is changing the way that Xbox is making games, and they're reaching higher in terms of the game's quality that they do release. They want that hit rate to be at least at par with what their competitors are doing. Final question, which will be the one that we spend the most time on, is does Microsoft have content delivery issues? Now, this is a big one, right? Like I had just said. Let me just kind of set some variables that I think are reasonable. Okay, I think it's fair to say at like a base value that AAA games on average will take approximately 3 to 4 years to complete from start to finish. Now, there are a few factors going on that is going to impact that 3 to 4 year timeline for Xbox. First of all, like I had kind of briefly mentioned earlier, is COVID. Now, I hear a lot of people say things like, tired of hearing COVID as an excuse, like the world's moving on from COVID, yada, yada. This shouldn't be something that is brought up anymore in terms of explaining away game delays. And I totally understand the sentiment, but I just want to make something extremely clear. COVID, when it originally hit, delayed all games, okay? It didn't just delay games that were close to release. So if you had a game that was, say, on year 3 of a 4-year dev cycle, and then COVID hit, and that game got delayed by a year, like, let's say, I don't know, Elden Ring, Halo Infinite, Horizon, like those games, right? They were all delayed because of COVID and potentially other factors, but I think COVID was a major factor in those delays. That doesn't mean that a game that may have been in its first year of development during COVID, they just didn't get any delays. All those games were still delayed. So if a game entered development in 2019 and then COVID hit in 2020, that original release date that they may have had of 2022 is now going to be something like 2023 because COVID affected all games. I feel like people are looking at the delays that had already happened and then they expect that no more delays will happen because for more or less the world is kind of moving on from COVID. That's not how it works. The time was lost. Whether it was lost at the beginning of development, the middle of development, or the end of development, the time was lost. The disruption happened. Okay. So these COVID delays are going to happen for the next like 2 or 3 years. All these games that were in these 3 to 4 year cycles at any point in time during COVID are going to have disruptions to that development. And that will come out at the end when they go to release it. It will affect the release date. So COVID is still affecting games. Okay. You can't just write it off. Anyways, it's enough about COVID. The other thing that's impacting Xbox is not only did they make all these acquisitions, because keep in mind, when Xbox rolled into E3 2018, they had 5 studios total. And one of them was just only making Minecraft. Okay. So now they have 22. That is like a legitimate reboot of the entire Xbox project. Okay. They basically were on the cutting room floor, as if reports are to be believed. They were literally going to cancel Xbox. And the options were cancel Xbox, cut our losses and move on, or invest heavily and basically reboot the entire thing. And they obviously chose to reboot it. And they went from 5 studios to now having 22 and more, because that's not even counting what's coming with potentially with Activision. Now, of these new studios that Xbox acquired, most of them were actually small teams that were acquired with the intention of scaling those small teams up into big teams to develop AAA projects. So it's not as simple as buying something like Compulsion and then saying, now you're going to make a AAA game starting now, and the clock of that 3 to 4 years starts. No, that scaling process of hiring and ramping up and doing all of that during the pandemic is a thing. Like, those teams need to scale up to double, triple, quadruple, in some cases have 5 times the staff, build up that huge staff, train them all, get them all ramped up, explain the vision and the direction of the game, and get them on task and start the development cycle. That also adds time to that 3 to 4 years. How much time? I mean, that's up in the air. I don't have the exact answer of how long each studio was affected by this scaling up, but I do know that literally almost all of them were, okay? Teams like Double Fine, Compulsion, In Exile, Ninja Theory, they're all small teams that are now doubling or tripling in size to meet the scopes of their new project. You have teams like Obsidian and Playground, who I'm sure you're saying those are already AAA game developers. Forza is a AAA game. The Outer Worlds is a AAA game. Like, they don't need to scale up. Well, that's not the case because they bought those studios and then added additional teams to them. Obsidian and Playground are both responsible for developing simultaneously 2 AAA games. And sometimes even more than that if you count something like Grounded, okay? You have the Initiative, which was announced with almost no employees and had to be built up from scratch, which is the most scaling of all of them. Bethesda, when they were acquired, they were a relatively well-oiled machine when they joined, and it shows with their releases. They've released a ton of games since they've been acquired. Not all of those games are actually, I don't think any of those games are really on Xbox, sadly, but they have been pumping out a lot of titles, including the 2 that are coming next year in the first or second quarter. My point is that this scaling up process also takes time. And I think it's fair to say that it's going to impact that 3 to 4 year dev cycle. Now, you might not think it's fair, but I think that any team that is near doubling in size and ramping up new staff during a pandemic are likely going to see anywhere from a 6 to 12 month delay on top of that 3 to 4 year window that we talked about earlier. In some cases, it might be a little bit less. I don't think in many cases it will be much more than 12 months, but that's a pretty significant amount of time that is getting added into that 3 to 4 year cycle. If I look at what's happening across the industry in terms of other studios facing the same issues with COVID and whatnot, and the delays that their games have had, I think that this kind of lines up and is a reasonable expectation. So let's dive deep into this and let's look at every Xbox game studio with this information in mind and see how these delivery issues are affecting Microsoft. Let's see what games we should have expected by now and why it's taking so long for these games to come out, okay? So first up is Compulsion. They released We Happy Few in 2018. After that release, they released 3 big DLC packs that released sporadically until the end of 2019. Now, they're scaling up big for their next game, and factoring in scaling and COVID, that 3 to 4 year window would put them right into 2023 to 2024 as a reasonable release window. Okay, so they're not expected to have anything out yet since they were acquired, based on the timelines of what they had been doing, what they had previously released, and what they're going to release. And just a side note, that 2023 to 2024 release window timeline, that's going to be popping up a lot. Okay, let's keep going. Double Fine. They released Psychonauts 2 after being delayed to big time critical praise, with the creator of the game and the head of the studio saying that major features like the boss battles were potentially going to get cut if not for the delays and the extra funding from Microsoft. So that game came out in 2021, and because of that, I think it's pretty understandable to suspect that they're not going to have anything releasing in 2022. Like, their next game is probably a little ways out, I think it's safe to say. But still, releasing a game in 2021. The Initiative. The Initiative would have had the hardest job of all in terms of scaling when they were announced, as they did not even have a leadership team fully established. They had a studio head and a couple other employees. Let alone having a full development team. It would have likely taken at least a year, potentially 2 years alone, just to be able to scale up to a full AAA development team that is actively developing Perfect Dark. And the game itself would probably have taken 3 years on top of that. Okay? They didn't even get to scale up to a full AAA development team size. I think they're sitting around 50 or 60 people, and they've actually contracted a full-scale development team in Crystal Dynamics to get this process moving along, okay? So if you take that time, the 2018 announcement of them being a studio, add in the time that it would have taken to scale up even to 60 people, get the project rolling, get the ideas rolling, get the direction and stuff set up, and then start hiring and bringing in Crystal Dynamics, that still puts you in the 2023 to 2024 window. Potentially even later, depending on how long Crystal Dynamics has been there and whatnot. It is harder to scale during a global pandemic. Like, I get it. You don't want to hear about COVID and whatnot, but it affects everything, okay? Next up is In Exile. In Exile was originally a relatively small team, but they just released Wasteland 3 in 2020 and supported that game with 2 large expansion packs that took them into early 2021, I believe. They're now working on a AAA game, and since Wasteland 3 was only released in 2020, I think it's fair to say we shouldn't expect that game in 2022. I think even 2023 would be pretty early for that one. Ninja Theory is next. The original Hellblade was actually only made by 20 people, and since being acquired by Microsoft, Ninja Theory has ballooned to have over 120 staff at this point, over 5 times as much. They also released Bleeding Edge in 2020, which obviously was a smaller team within Ninja Theory, but still, they released a full game in 2020, And the scope of Hellblade 2 is rumored to be much larger than the first game, which obviously explains the 500% increase in staff. The thing about Hellblade to keep in mind, though, is that game is heavily reliant on motion capture, and motion capture, it was one of the few things that was extremely difficult to do from home, especially the type of motion capture that Ninja Theory does, as they're industry leading in that department. So with that being said, and the release, the amount of time between the original release of Hellblade to scaling, I think it's reasonable to assume, again, 2023, 2024 as a release date. All right, Obsidian. Obsidian has scaled into a 3-game studio, working on Avowed, Grounded, and The Outer Worlds 2. The original Outer Worlds was released in 2019 on current-gen consoles with a 2020 Switch port and story DLC that released both in 2020 and 2021. Grounded released in open beta at some point in 2020 as well. Avowed will likely be the next game that they release, and it's hard to imagine that game would have went into full development before 2020, which would again put it into that 2023-2024 release window, the 3 to 4 years that we were talking about. Playground have released 2 Forza Horizon games since being acquired, and similarly to the Initiative, have been building its second team nearly from scratch since being acquired. This would give it a similar release window to Perfect Dark of 2023-2024. I'm talking about Fable, obviously. Undead Labs. Undead Labs released State of Decay 2 as a team of nearly 60 people, and have supported that game a ton since its release, with DLC releasing even 3 years since the original release of the game. There's a lot of support that goes into that game, which is very, very commendable. There have been reports of some issues at the studio, but even with that aside, just based on how much work they've been putting into post-launch content for State of Decay 2, it's likely that with the scaling that would incur by moving the game to Unreal Engine 5 and ramping up the game studio or ramping up the studio staff, and also changing the scope of the game to be much more or much larger than State of Decay 2, I think it's safe to say that State of Decay 3 is at least a year out. I think it's a little bit telling that they showcased it, even though it was a CGI trailer, at the showcase last year. But I don't think there's any chance that game comes out in 2022. And I don't think it's reasonable to assume that. Then you have Bethesda. Obviously, the biggest acquisition that has been successfully completed so far. You have several studios within Bethesda, so let's go through them. Arkane Lyon released Deathloop in 2021. After being delayed, again with critical praise, but still, that game came out in 2021. Now you'll likely see a release on that game on Xbox, which is a big deal that I think a lot of people are blowing over. See that release in 2022, I should say. But I think after releasing a major game like that in 2021, it's safe to assume that Lyon is not going to release another game in 2022. I think that whatever they do next is quite far off. Arkane Austin released Prey in 2017. Followed up that release with the Prey DLC, Moon Crash, and stuff like that. They also helped Machine Games with the Wolfenstein franchise in 2019 with Youngblood and Cyberpilot, and they were due to release Redfall this year in 2022. And that release date honestly lined up with their typical trajectory, and unfortunately, it was delayed. But that trajectory doesn't include things like COVID, and I know you don't want to hear that, but COVID is a legitimate thing that affects all games, like I have said several times. Unfortunately, the game was delayed. It was delayed by 3 to 6 months, or close to that. So hopefully it lands, and that's coming soon. So that is the first game so far that we've talked about that made sense to have a 2022 release date, and unfortunately, it got delayed. Tango Gameworks released Ghostwire Tokyo in 2022, so that was only a month or so ago, and there's no chance that they're releasing another game this year, and it's very unreasonable to expect them to, obviously. id Software released Doom Eternal and its 2 DLC campaigns from 2020 to 2021, so again, very unreasonable to expect them to follow that up quickly with a 2022 release. I don't expect to see anything from them in terms of releases for quite a while. ZeniMax Online has released the Giant Greymore expansion for Elder Scrolls Online in 2021 and is going to release another huge expansion in a couple months with High Isle in 2022. They have literally kept on schedule for several years in a row and are basically pumping out content for that game like clockwork. Machine Games has released Cyberpilot and Youngblood in 2019. 3 to 4 years from there, plus COVID delays, will put you, again, right at that 2023, 2024 window. I do think it's a little bit strange because I'm not 100% sure how the workload was levied between Machine Games and Arkane Austin on those Wolfenstein Youngblood and Wolfenstein Cyberpilot. So depending on how that shakes out, I do think it's a little bit strange that we haven't seen what they're working on yet, whether that be Wolfenstein 3 or we know they're working on Indiana Jones, but I'm talking about what their next release is going to be. It's going to be one of those two games likely. And whatever it is, I think that it's going to be relatively far in development. But again, I think it's a 2023, 2024 release. And then finally, you have Bethesda Game Studios. Although obviously they released Blades, the mobile game, which is I don't expect was a very large development team. They released that in 2020. Fallout 76 released in 2018 and has had DLC coming out consistently ever since. With the biggest DLC yet to come, which is supposed to come this year, called The Pit. Historically, the jump between Morrowind and Oblivion was 4 years. Skyrim to Fallout 4 was also 4 years. Fallout 4 to Fallout 76 was 3 years, and look what happened there with the release of Fallout 76. Now, just as a little aside, Fallout 76 has actually come a very long way, and I do recommend jumping into it now, especially if you have a next-gen console. With the next-gen updates, it is actually turned into a very good game ever since the Wastelanders update. But at launch, it was a little bit rough, and that was with a 3-year development cycle. So, after 4 years from 2018, that puts you right at the original release date for Starfield 2022. And as confident as they were about that release date, unfortunately, it slipped by around 3 to 6 months, the first or second quarter of next year. So in this entire list, we went through every studio that Microsoft has. We looked at every game that they've released last, and we, I think, gave a pretty fair assessment as to when we should expect their next game to come out. And only 2 of them were suspected or made sense or were realistically going to come out in 2022. Unfortunately, they both got delayed, but like I had said, I know you don't want to hear this, but COVID affects everything, okay? Now, I don't feel like anything I've said here is like completely outrageous in terms of timelines. I feel like those are pretty realistic timelines when you factor in how long it typically takes to make a AAA game and how long these teams have had and the impacts of the pandemic. None of these games from all of the Xbox studios, outside of Redfall and Starfield, line up with a 2022 release date or any release date before 2022 since they were acquired. I really can't see how this points to some kind of failure with Microsoft's management or their ability to consistently deliver games. I think it reflects more on just simply the fact that the timelines of the games that were in progress and the studio's position in terms of what they were developing when they got acquired not matching up with the internal studios that Microsoft already has. If you look at something like Nintendo or Sony, their timelines are planned out several years in advance, and they have been releasing games with a good cadence because they've had time to develop that cadence. When you add this many teams to your portfolio, it's not going to perfectly mesh with what you already have. These timelines have to develop, and they have to kind of coexist with each other. And it's simply the fact that they just don't line up yet. Now, that is going to somewhat happen. This drought, for lack of a better term, that we're experiencing now will likely be the complete opposite after, with 2023 and 2024 being probably pretty huge months in terms of Xbox first-party releases. But at the same time, who knows what comes after that, because we don't really know how the timelines are going to square off once the dust settles, once this big wave of games that we're expecting comes. The one thing that I'll mention really quick as well is I do think that it's a little bit weird that we don't know what the Coalition's doing. Outside of Forza, the Coalition has been the only real consistently good studio that Microsoft has had in the Xbox One era. And they have been pretty consistent releasing their games within 3-year cycles. And I think we're approaching the 4th year now with since outside of Gears 5. And we really don't know what they're doing. There's rumors of them completely moving away from Gears or simply just doing Gears 6, but in Unreal Engine 5. I expect to see more at the showcase, but I will say that is a bit strange that we don't know what's going on there. The future of Xbox is bright, and so is the future of Sony and Nintendo. The high tide of some of the fantastic releases from PlayStation last gen and the Nintendo in the Switch era raises all ships in the industry, and although COVID is a megaton bomb that blew up everything for a little while, the light at the end of the tunnel is starting to peek through as teams learn and adapt. Thank you for listening, and have a good one.